Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Fire Emblem. This is my first ever YouTube video, and I plan to do a lot more Fire Emblem and SRPG related content in the future. Today though, I'm going to explain the Fire Emblem Thracia 776 Iceberg. Now I made this iceberg myself, and I'll reference the sources I used for it as they come up in entries. I especially want to thank all of the contributors to Serenus Forest, the Fire Emblem Wiki, and the Cunning Room Floor, without whom this video will be way harder to research. I want to give a special shout out to the members of the FE5 Hacking Hell Discord server, who helped me out tremendously with this iceberg. Many entries would not even be on here without their help. Advent and Louis' Thracia 776 iceberg was a major source for entries on the later tiers, and I appreciate them allowing me to use their entries on this iceberg. Now, very briefly, an iceberg is just a format which lists information and theories about something, and the idea is it gets more complicated or obscure the further down the iceberg you go. This iceberg has a mix of facts and fan theories, as well as some trivia regarding the various English translations of Thracia 776 and the Western fan community. Also, I have a document with some things relating to the entries and the sources I used in the description. If anything I mentioned sounds interesting, you can find a link to it there. This iceberg turned out to be a lot longer than I initially planned, so I'm going to be splitting this video into parts. The whole thing is written, so hopefully part 2 will be out pretty soon. So without further ado, let's get into the Thracia 776 iceberg. Fire Emblem 4 references. Since it's a Megquel to FE4, Thracia references is a lot. I'll get more into specifics in later entries, but basically Thracia has many references to the game, including sharing many characters and Thracia referring to events from FE4. Reinhardt and Heroes. If people know anything about Thracia 776 or even just Fire Emblem in general, they probably know about Reinhardt. This is because while he's a minor character in one of the least played games in the series, he's become something of a meme and fan favorite because of the mobile game Fire Emblem Heroes. He was first made playable in that game in the February 27, 2017 update, but he wouldn't achieve meme status until October of that year, when a scandal known as Iragate happened. This is a long story, but basically many people believed that the fan favorite character Ira was going to be given to players for free, and when she wasn't, and was also super broken gameplay-wise too, players weren't happy. However, people quickly realized that Reinhardt was actually an amazing and easily available counter to her in the game, and this was expressed in a legendary reply to the Ira announcement tweet, which was Google translated, quote, "I no more money to you. I now use the Reinhardt." Though Reinhardt quickly became a meme, and to this day he's consistently one of the most popular Thracia characters in official character popularity polls. He actually shot up from 584th place in the 2017 Choose Your Legends poll to 11th in the 2018 one, gaining over 15,000 votes. This shows the impact the memes had on him. He placed in the top 20 in Choose Your Legends for 2025, so it's still going strong too. He's also one of the most represented Thracia characters in Fire Emblem media, despite being such a minor character originally. Also, shout out to Shiny Mimikyu, who did a great write-up on Iragate on Reddit, which is in the doc in the description. Abel is Bridget. This entry refers to the fact that Abel is actually the same person as Bridget from FE4 after she lost her memories. This is canon, as Abel's ending in Thracia mentions her regaining her memories as Bridget and reuniting with her children. There is also a minor hint to this in the final chapter of Thracia. If Abel is not rescued in Chapter 24X, she will appear as an enemy Deadlord in her sniper class from FE4, and the generic Deadlord who replaces her if she is rescued is also a sniper. Staff misses. In Thracia 776, staves have a chance to miss. Specifically, staves have a base accuracy of 60, except for the Torch Staff, which has a base accuracy of 100. Staff hit percentage is base accuracy plus 4 times the skill percent chance of hitting. And a lot of sources claim that there is a 99 hit cap on staves like with other weapons, but this isn't actually true. Once a unit has 10 or more skill, they will never miss with a staff. This means that staves will mostly miss in the early game, and once your staff users have leveled up skill enough, it will never happen. Still, this mechanic has become rather infamous and adds to the game's reputation for difficulty and unfairness. I think some people are even scared off playing it after hearing about this, which is unfortunate. It's also crazy to me how most resources still give the wrong calculations for it. Capture. This is one of the most important and unique mechanics in Thracia. In addition to the rescue mechanic, which is found in later Fire Emblem entries as well, units can capture enemy units during battle. In exchange for a stat debuff in the battle, units can try to capture the enemy, and will succeed if they reduce the enemy's HP to 0. However, instead of killing them, they will be captured, or basically force rescued by the unit. Units without weapons can also be captured with no battle. The player can then take the enemy's equipment and items, and either release or hold onto them. This is very important, because weapons and items are otherwise scarce in Thracia. However, player units can also be captured, and though they can be rescued if the capturing enemy is defeated, their inventory will be lost if it isn't stolen or captured back. If a captured unit is carried off the map by an enemy, they will be unavailable until Chapter 21X, which is unlocked by having a unit captured like this, or being left behind in an escape map. If a unit manages to get captured and taken off screen after this point, they are basically lost forever and considered dead. Route Split. In Chapter 15 of Thracia 776, the player can choose between two possible paths. They can either go to Fort Norden or Melfi Forest, and they will get different Chapters 16 and 17 based on their choice. These routes have different maps, obtainable items, and recruitable characters. There is still debate over which one is the best option. English-speaking fans either refer to the routes as A for Fort Norden and B for Melfi Forest, or as the solar and lunar routes after the skill tomes you can get in each one. In the Japanese Thracia community, they're referred to by the kanji for fort and forest. Hey, just adding in post that apparently the official Thracia website uses the A-B distinction, so I guess the official distinction is the A and B one. Later entries in Fire Emblem have avoided canonizing one route over the other. Route splits would later appear in all of the GBA Fire Emblem games, and then the concept would be taken to its logical extreme in Fates and Three Houses. Also, if you choose the B route, you're insane. Warp tiles are literally the worst thing in Thracia. Child hunts. This is the concept and plot point in FE4 in Thracia, where the Loptirian Empire regularly kidnaps children. There is actually a bit of inconsistency in what exactly happens from there. The common belief in-game is that they are all sacrificed to Loptus, but in Thracia Julius says that the children are made to fight to the death in a series of gladiatorial battles, and the winners are made into a new class of nobility. Granted, he's trying to put it in a good light for Ishtar, so the truth is probably somewhere in between. Either way, it is one of the darkest concepts in the whole series, and also plays an important part in the plot of Thracia 776. Several characters, most notably Olwen, join Leif in order to stop the practice. War crimes. It's something of a meme that Fire Emblem characters commit a lot of war crimes, and Leif's army commits their fair share. The most notable is probably using civilians as human shields in Chapter 17b, which is a war crime according to the United Nations. Though to be fair, this is optional and the civilians are willing meat shields. You can also recruit characters under 15 to fight, another war crime by modern standards. You can also kill or hold hostage unarmed enemies and healers, which is also a war crime, but Leif doesn't know about the Geneva Convention, so it's probably fine. Pitch Black Fog of War. Thracia introduced Fog of War to the series, which is where you can't see most of the map. But unlike later entries in the series where it looks more like actual fog and you can see what tile type something is through it, in Thracia it is just a completely black area of screen and you can't see any information about it. This can make it kind of annoying when you don't even know where doors are, since Thracia has indoor Fog of War maps. Notably, every Gaiden chapter has Fog of War, and only Chapter 12 has it outside of these. Rankings. At the end of Thracia 776, the player is given a ranking from either E to AAA or E to SSS depending on the version of the game being played. This ranking is based on the number of turns taken in-game and the number of surviving recruited units. Higher ranks are given for lower turn counts and higher recruitment/survival counts. The ranking affects the CGs shown in the credits of a playthrough, with more being given for higher ranks. For E rank or above, you get this family portrait of Quan, Ethlin, Altena, and Leif. For D or above, you get this image of who I believe is Nyorun, Leif's ancestor. and it gets a bit complicated from here because the CGs you can unlock and at what rank depends on the version of the game you are playing, and don't worry, I'll explain the different game versions later on. For the original release, you can unlock the CG of Quan with Finn, Glade, and Selphina at C rank, and then for rank B in the original release, or rank C in the later release, you unlock this one of Altena and Arian. For rank A in the original release, or rank B in the later release, you unlock the CG of Quan and Ethlin. Finally, only in the later release, an A ranking unlocks the CG of Leaf with Raedric. An A rank in either version also unlocks the Sound Room, which I'll explain in a bit. Fire Emblem TCG. The Fire Emblem trading card game, which is not to be confused with the later Fire Emblem Cypher trading card game, was a trading card game that was published in Japan from 2001 to 2004. It featured characters from Mystery of the Emblem, Genealogy of the Holy War, and of course Thracia 776. It also featured guest artists, many of whom would go on to work on Fire Emblem Cypher and Heroes. There's not a lot of information on it in English, but it's notable for being the first extra material to feature Thracia prominently. Also, though again information is kind of hard to find in English, there was a popularity poll connected to the Fire Emblem TCG where Finn came in first place. Sound Room. After completing Thracia with at least an A rank for the first time, the Sound Room is unlocked on the main menu. Here, the player can listen to the game's soundtrack and view the CGs from the ending credits. It is notable for being the first formal Sound Room in the series, as this feature would appear in later games as well, and it's also just kind of a fun little feature. Shia Patch. The Shia Patch was the first full English language patch for Thracia 776. It's named after its creator, Shia. It was first produced back in 2007 when Shia was still in high school, and it is not a perfect patch. We'll get to the best examples of that later on, but it also just has many bugs and glitches that make it nigh incomprehensible at some points, especially in Chapter 20. However, for over a decade it was the only English patch of the game, so although it was not perfect by any means, it did enable English speakers to play the game for the first time. It was never completely finished, and it has since been replaced by the Project Exile and Little Manster patches, which are also on this Iceberg later on. Also, there might be a lost, more complete version of the patch, which was allegedly lost when Shia's hard drive died. There's also a slightly updated version of the patch by Lethris, just putting that out there to make sure it's documented. Overall, this patch is one of the most important things from the English-speaking Thracia community, since it spawned so many memes and really brought the game to a new audience at the time. Double heals. Healing staffs in Thracia don't only have a chance to miss, they can also hit twice. Once again, there's a complicated formula for this, which I'll just put on the screen here. This can trigger whenever the target of healing can still gain more HP after the first heal. It should be noted that only Heal, Mend, and Visit can do this, so unfortunately you can't double recover or double steal with the Thief Staff. This mechanic helps balance out staves being able to miss in my opinion. Linoan promotion. Linoan is unable to promote with a Master Seal like other units. Instead, she promotes during an event in Chapter 21 if she visits the church on the map. Also uniquely, she doesn't need to be at level 10 to promote. This promotion actually makes her kind of useful, as you get another high-rank staff user without having to spend a Master Seal. It also contains some neat lore, since it explains that her family actually has Naga Holy Blood, which is basically the Jew troll equivalent of being descended from Jesus. It's also the only case we see in-game of someone awakening their holy blood. However, this event is easy to miss if you don't know about it, because if any other character visits the church, it cannot be visited again. It's also kind of a pain to get her there because of all the ballista in the map. Soundtracks. Thracia 776 actually has 2 official soundtrack releases on CD. The first was released by Tokuma Japan Communications in 1999. It features the game's full soundtrack and 2 vocal arrangements, sung by Julia Shano. Wind. And Blowin' in the Wind. The former is an arrangement of a song from BS Fire Emblem Arcanea Saga, and the latter is a vocal version of the ending ballad which plays in the credits of Thracia 776. The lyrics refer to Quan and Ethlyn watching over Leif. Also, for some reason the cover art for this one is just a random stock art of a door that says 96 on it. The other one is the Fire Emblem Thracia 776 rearranged soundtrack, which was released in 2000 by Teichiku Records. It features 10 orchestral arrangements, 8 of songs from Thracia, and 2 from Genealogy of the Holy War. A fun bit of trivia for this is that it was performed by a group called FE Orchestra, who convened for this one album and then never did anything else. The cover art is also super funny to me. It's the polar opposite of the other soundtrack's cover, where there is no mistaking what this is from. Also, adding this in post because I found this out afterwards, apparently Wind and Blown in the Wind got an official release as a mini-CD too, also by Tokuma Japan Communications. It has some nice official art of Leif and Nana and his lyrics for Blown in the Wind on the inside of the case. Elite Mode. This entry refers to a hidden game mode in Thracia 776. If you press right, left, right, left, right, left, right, right, B, and then select on the home screen, a new option will appear to start the game on Elite Mode. In it, all unit experience is doubled. This makes the game a lot easier, and it's essentially identical to the easy mode in Fire Emblem Gaiden. It also doesn't affect ranking, so it's a good way to get a high ranking if you're struggling to do so normally. Movement level ups. Every unit in Thracia actually has a growth rate in their movement stat, in addition to their regular displayed stats. The growth rate for it is universally low, with a 1 to 3% growth rate for every character except Safi with 0% and Tina with 5%. Whenever it does happen though, it's really exciting and useful. I honestly wish the series would bring this mechanic back because I need a movement maxed Ike. Project Exile. Project Exile was the first complete English translation of Thracia 776. It was released in June of 2019 by the modder Zero-san, along with the team who you can all see credited on the screen now. Note that Zero-san edited the credits to remove some people from them in later versions. This alone is pretty telling for the patch's controversial nature. Some have been unhappy with its creative liberties, such as Zero-san changing game sprites, and the script not being a one-to-one with the Japanese. They see this as unfaithful to the source material. Others don't mind or even like the changes, yet more were just happy to have a relatively bug-free way to play the game in English. And there's a whole bunch of drama with Zero-san himself, and since Project Exile's original release, he's basically soured his reputation in the Fire Emblem community. I'll get more into the whole drama when we talk about the other translation patch, Lil Manster. I also want to mention that there is actually a Vice article about this translation that also just discusses the long path to getting a complete English translation. I'll link it in the doc. It's an interesting read, and it's honestly pretty funny to see them try to describe Thracia and its community. However, I do agree with the criticism that it doesn't credit some people who were very important to the patch, such as Zane Abernathy and Curb, who basically invented Thracia hacking in the West. Zero-san even credits them as being essential to this hack's existence, so it feels unfair to me. Also, Zane Abernathy makes a good case for the article being wrong about Thracia's supposed spaghetti code in his response to the article, also in the doc. Leif's light brand is from Ethlyn. In Fire Emblem 4, Leif's mother Ethlyn is given a light brand by Deirdre. In the second half of the game, Leif inherits Ethlyn's inventory, including the light brand if she still had it when she leaves the party in Part 1, though I don't know why you would use it over his iconic silver bow. He also starts with the light brand in Thracia, and it is obviously the same one as Ethlyn's, which is a nice bit of continuity. It's also mentioned in Thracia that Leif was willing to trade the sword for medical care for an injured Finn when he first met Abel, which is a great character moment in my opinion. The light brand also got a gameplay upgrade from FE4, as in FE5 it is Leif's personal weapon and also doubles as a vulnerary. Leif sucks in Engage. In Fire Emblem Engage, Leif appears as an emblem who can provide stat boosts, skills, and special gameplay advantages. While he does allow for units to inherit some useful skills like Vantage, he is generally agreed to be the worst of the equipable emblems. This is because his special skill can work against the player. It auto-equips the unit it is equipped to with whatever weapon has weapon triangle advantage when the unit is attacked. However, this can lead to some suboptimal matchups, such as choosing a weak magical sword over a bow when a wyvern unit attacks with a hand axe. His special weapons are also some of the weakest in the game, which means his special engage attack is also pretty weak. Some people even say that Leaf's true use in engage is to allow access to the Olwind bond ring, which is one of the best bond rings in the game. It seems that Leaf is cursed to always be overshadowed by the Frege siblings. At least the remix of Leaf's theme, which is playing in the background this whole time, is fire. Movement stars. This is another unique mechanic in Thracia. Every unit, including enemy units, has a number of movement stars from 0 to 5. Each movement star is a 5% chance to move again on their turn after they have acted. This can be incredibly useful if it occurs for one of your units, and incredibly annoying if an enemy gets it, though thankfully only some enemies have it. It's just another unique mechanic in Thracia that really adds to the experience and makes each unit feel unique. Bonus entry, the Sword vs Lance tweet. For some of the tiers I'm including bonus entries of stuff that I didn't put on the Iceberg, but I think are worth mentioning anyway. I just had to include this one. There's a pretty infamous tweet, and I'm not going to name and shame the person, but it's them saying Thracia is a game where, quote, the first map you only have sword users and the enemy all use lances. This is straight up wrong. Looking at your Chapter 1 roster, only a quarter of your units use swords, and one of them is able. Half the enemies don't even use lances either. Also, the weapon triangle disadvantage in Thracia is so minor that it wouldn't even matter if it were true, in Chapter 1 especially. This tweet has been widely clowned on as one of the prime examples of people just straight up saying things about Thracia that are completely false, which I have learned is a very common phenomenon. At least the parodies of it are pretty great. Dancer promotion. The only possible playable dancer in Thracia is Lara. She starts as a thief in Chapter 4, and only promotes into the dancer class if she talks to Pern when he is an enemy in Chapter 12X. It's easily missable without prior knowledge, but having a dancer can be really useful for the rest of the game, especially since Lara retains her lockpicking utility, and she can even dance twice in one turn if she procs her movement star. Lil Manster. Lil Manster started as an update to Project Exile, led by a previous contributor to that patch, Miakis, along with a team you can see listed on screen now. It was first released on December 23rd of 2019, and it makes some script adjustments to keep the patch closer to the original Japanese script compared to Exile, fixes some bugs, and basically completes what was left unfinished by the time of the last update to Project Exile in the summer of 2019, such as implementing a working sound room. It also has a more readable font and implements a bunch of quality of life patches from Zane Abernathy and Ultimage, including toggles for hidden stats and visible HP bars, and the option to rearrange units before a map if you want. With all these updates, it's pretty much a completely new translation patch, and I'd say it's pretty definitively the best way to play the game in English at this point. Unfortunately, this means it's also time to discuss the drama regarding this patch in Project Exile, which I promised I would discuss earlier. Basically, Miakis and the Lil Manster team released the patch, and almost immediately Siro-san, the team leader of Project Exile, got very angry that it was released without his permission. This is perhaps a little bit understandable, if short-sighted. But what he did from there basically turned everyone against him. He basically demanded that Miakis take it down, and she didn't because she saw it as just a new project based on her previous work with the patch after Siro-san stopped updating Project Exile. And because regardless of ownership, you can't really claim any kind of real infringement for a fan translation patch. He first attempted to deplatform Miakis in the patch, and also left the main Thracia hacking Discord where Exile was worked on to create his own Discord server, presumably with blackjack and hookers. By the way, this original server is the Hacking Hell Discord server where I got a lot of information for the Iceberg. And when none of these things worked, he literally filed DMCA copyright takedown requests to Miakis' Dropbox and Google Drive. This was incredibly stupid because again, this is a fan translation and it wasn't and cannot be copyrighted. The takedown requests were successfully appealed, and Siro-san hasn't been heard from since. In response, even sites which were supportive of Zero-Sun initially turned against him. Notably, after the DMCA takedown attempt, the site Fire Emblem Universe, where Zero-Sun had hosted a lot of Project Exile content, asked him to remove the thread for it, which he did. He then burned whatever shred of goodwill he had left by editing the credits to Project Exile to remove people who he didn't like anymore. Zane Abernathy, who was basically the pioneer of Thracia hacking in the West, also got tired of the drama and withdrew support for projects using his menu translation, which was also very controversial. He would later allow a few select people, including Miakis and Ultimage, to use his tools, but he still wants them private. The point is, some people took Thracia hacking way too seriously, and some people don't understand how fan projects work. But in the end, we ended up with the best translation patch for Thracia, which is the basis for pretty much any hacking of the game from this point on. As for the patch as it stands currently, Miakis released version 1.08 of Lil Manster on December 24th of 2021, featuring some more toggles for the quality of life features added and bug fixes, and also some small script updates. Development slowed after this point, and on December 19th of 2024, Miakis announced that work on Lil Manster had essentially stopped due to the sheer amount of work needed for a final script review being unfeasible for her at the moment. But she did release all of the build files for Lil Manster, which people are free to use however they wish. This essentially makes Thracia hacking easier for the entire world, and all sorts of projects and new translation patches can come from this. So in the end, I'd say this whole story does have a happy ending. Fatigue. This is one of the last entries just covering basic mechanics, I promise. Fatigue is one of the most unique mechanics in Thracia in my opinion, because it changes how you play the game compared to every other entry in the series. Basically, attacking, stealing, dancing, or using a staff increases the unit's fatigue, and when their fatigue level exceeds their maximum HP, they get the fatigued status. A fatigued unit cannot be deployed in the next chapter, unless you bench them for a chapter or use an S-rank to reset their fatigue immediately. S-ranks can also be used in chapter to reset current fatigue. Leaf is the only unit that cannot get fatigued since he is force deployed in every chapter. Fatigue will also not kick in until after the Manster chapters, so you first see its effects in chapter 8 when pretty much your entire Manster squad will be fatigued. I think it's a neat gameplay story integration because it really gives me the impression that all of your units over the past chapters were really pushing themselves to make it to safety, and then they finally have to rest. I should also note that using staves increases fatigue the most, with up to 5 points of fatigue for an A rank or personal staff, compared to just 1 point for attacking. This means that by the end of the game you'll probably have a full rotating door of high rank staff users. I personally really like this mechanic because it keeps you from just benching most units and making one super over-leveled squad, like I find myself doing in most other Fire Emblem games. If you really hate fatigue, presumably because you're a casual, don't worry. You still have two options. First, you can take advantage of a glitch in Chapter 14X. If you completely disarm enemy units which are carrying an NPC in that chapter, and then have a unit of yours escape and end the turn, when the enemy carrying the NPC moves next, it will count as the NPC escaping, which normally triggers them to give you an S-rank. You can get up to 60 S-ranks this way if you set it up correctly. Fortunately, Thracia Hacking Legend I has footage of this glitch. It's still not really worth it. If you need more S-ranks than the game normally gives you, you're probably just playing it wrong honestly. Second, you can just kill enough of your units so you don't meet the minimum unit deployment number for a chapter. In this case, the game will ignore fatigue so you can actually play the chapter. Awakening Thracia DLC. Fire Emblem Awakening references a lot of the previous games in the series in its DLC, including Thracia 776. First, in Champions of Yore 2, Leaf appears as an enemy thief. Then, in Lost Bloodlines 1, Leaf can be recruited as a playable character, with nice new art by Sachika Wada. The whole map for this DLC is a reference to FE4 and 5, featuring the main map theme from Thracia and many characters from the games as enemies. Leaf just plays like any other Einherjar unit, but it is interesting that he's a trickster instead of a more standard Lord class. Of course, he should be reclassed to a sniper as quickly as possible so he can use his iconic silver bow. A special sword called Leaf's Blade is available in the base game in Awakening, and Leaf comes with it in both Champions of Yore and in Lost Bloodlines. It acts kind of like a thief sword in FE4, where it steals gold, or in this case bullion, from enemies when a unit attacks with it. This is probably a reference to Capture, which is a nice little Easter egg. The only other thing to note about Leaf in Awakening is that when you beat the DLC map in Lost Bloodlines, you can talk to Leaf. You can see the whole exchange on screen now, but I do think it's funny that you can say you don't know him at all, which to be fair most players outside of Japan probably would say when Awakening released, and that unlike him you totally have godlike powers, which makes him talk about his lack of major holy blood and what it might mean. If you play the DLC, please be nice to Leaf. He's already cursed to be an Awakening DLC character, so you don't have to make it worse for him. Xavier recruitment. Xavier is a recruitable enemy in Chapter 18 of Thracia, and he's infamous for his difficult recruitment conditions. In story, he's working for the Empire-aligned Gustav in order to protect the people of Leonster. He's aware that he's seen as a traitor to Leonster because of this, but if Leaf's army manages to rescue his soldiers' families who are being held hostage, Leaf can then persuade him to join his army and fight for Leonster proper once again. Gameplay-wise, this means that there are 8 civilian green units, each corresponding to one of the 8 armor knights in the center of the map. To recruit Xavier, all 8 green units have to talk to the right enemy, and then Leaf can talk to Xavier to recruit him. However, this is not easy, because enemies will attack the green units and the soldiers once they also turn into green units after being talked to. But they all need to be alive to recruit Xavier. So it requires a lot of enemy manipulation, or some specialized strategies like using sleep swords and staves to achieve this. It's one of the hardest recruitments in the series, though personally I'd say that Sephiron in FE10 is more of a pain to recruit. Xavier's recruitment definitely adds to the game's infamy though, and you'd hope that after all the pain of getting him he'd be an absolute combat god, but really he's just decent. His authority star, which gives a slight boost to your army's hit and avoid when deployed, is nice, but he struggles against the late game dark mages pretty badly, and he's really hurt by his low movement on outdoor maps. So it's still probably not worth it to recruit him unless you're going for 100% recruitment. Mythology references. Like all Fire Emblem games, Thracia 776 references a lot of real-world mythology and history. Yggdrasil has a lot of people and places named after Scandinavian and Celtic mythology in particular. The 12 Crusaders and holy weapons are primarily named after concepts from Scandinavian mythology, and most place names in Thracia are of Irish origin. Specifically, the different kingdoms in northern Thracia are named after the traditional provinces of Ireland. There are also some more specific references to these mythologies, which I'll describe in more detail when they come up in the Iceberg. Flashcard and cartridge version differences. When Thracia 776 released, it wasn't actually like most Super Famicom games, or video games in general, where you just, buy the game at the store. You see, in the late 90s up until 2007, Nintendo had a Japanese exclusive service called Nintendo Power, not to be confused with the magazine of the same name. You could buy official blank game cartridges for the Super Famicom or Game Boy, and then go to a Lawson's convenience store to purchase and download games onto them. Some older titles, including Fire Emblem, Mystery of the Emblem, and Genealogy of the Holy War, were available, but some new games also made their debut here. Thracia 776 was one of these. It was actually exclusive to the service on its release on September 1st of 1999, until it got a proper physical release the next year. I've seen some speculation the service existed because by the time it was released, the Nintendo 64 had already been released, so Nintendo was using it as a way to release a few more Super Famicom games without giving them dedicated shelf space in game stores. Keep in mind that Thracia 776 was one of the last Super Famicom games to officially release, so it's kind of impressive it got a physical release in store shelves at all. There might also be another reason for Thracia in particular to release this way, which I'll discuss later on. Also, an important note is that when you downloaded a game using this service, you would get a printed copy of a game manual at checkout, either for free or for a few yen. So this release of Thracia did come with a manual, which will be important in a later entry. If you want to know more about the Nintendo Power service, I recommend Kelsey Levin's video on it, linked in the doc. For For about 6 months, it was the only way to obtain Thracia 776. Mostly. I'll explain more in the next entry. Then, on January 21st of 2000, the game got a proper standard cartridge release in stores. However, the flashcard and cartridge releases are actually different versions of the game. The biggest difference is the ranking system, as I discussed earlier. The cartridge version adds an S rank to the possible rankings, and there is one exclusive credit CD to each version. The copyright year on the title screen is also updated in the newer cartridge release to display the year 2000 as well. There are also some bug fixes, most notably, in the Nintendo Power version, there was a bug where weapons effective against cavalry were not super effective against specifically female mage knights. The cartridge version fixed this so all mage knights are weak to weapons like the rapier and the poleaxe. This actually gives Olwen and promoted Miranda a slight nerf. To go even deeper, there are actually 2 versions of the flashcard release. The second one fixes bugs from the initial flashcard release, and the cartridge version is based on the revised flashcard version. Pretty much all ROMs floating out there and all hacks of the game are based on the cartridge version, but if you want a physical copy of Thracia, you can find both versions for sale. Neither of them are cheap. Deluxe Edition. When Thracia released, there was also a Deluxe Pack Edition, which was basically the collector's edition. It came with a lot of cool stuff. In all, it has some super cute Pegasus and Wyvern plushies, a nice fabric map of Thracia along with red and blue pins so you can map out your journey through the game, or maybe keep track of what territory you control or the enemy controls. Character cards, and it's pretty interesting that the only enemy included in the set is Reinhardt, since this predates his meme status. And a VHS tape which explains the game's story background and mechanics called The World of Fire Emblem. A card thanking the buyer for their purchase with an itemized list of contents, and of course the game, which comes in a pre-written Nintendo Power flashcard. There's also a sticker included so you can actually label the game, so it isn't just the generic flashcard branding. Because it's in a flashcard, it is almost certainly the original Nintendo Power version of the game, and that will be important in a second. All of these things came in a special box that's designed to look like a chest, complete with a key. Not many of these were produced or sold, so today it is an extremely rare collector's edition that goes for hundreds of dollars. I'd say it's one of the holy grails of Fire Emblem merchandise, and I would commit several crimes to get my hands on one personally. If you're interested in seeing the VHS, there's a link to it with a translated English voiceover in the doc. The entry originally ended there, but I went down a massive rabbit hole finding out more information about the Deluxe Edition's release, and it's actually a lot more complicated than you might think. First, there's 2 different release dates that are commonly given for it. Some sites like GameFAQ and VG Archive give a release date of January 21st, 2000. I believe this is wrong because that is actually the release date of the cartridge release of Thracia 776. The Deluxe Edition uses the earlier flashcard release, so if it had the same release date as the cartridge release, it would surely use the updated version instead. This leads me to the earlier date I see for its release, August 28th of 1999. Twitter user @SorerGlider was able to access some very old listings for it on some old secondhand hobby store sites. Both Washimbong and Surugaya JP give its release as the 28th of August 1999. This would actually make the Deluxe Edition the first version of Thracia 776 available for sale, predating the official flashcard release by several days. But these sites might still be basing the date around the letter included with the edition, which is also dated August 28th of 1999. This would mean the letter was preemptively dated to August 28th for release, but I cannot confirm that's the case. However, I do believe that this date is closer to its actual release than the later date given, because it uses the flashcard version. Next, there's also some conflicting information for the price. The old listing for it on Surugaya JP says it originally retailed for 6,600 yen, or around $50 in 2025. I believe this is also wrong. This would put it closer to the price of an average Super Famicom game at the time, which leads me to believe that once again this is mixing up the Deluxe Edition with the cartridge release. I believe the actual price was 9,800 yen, or around $70 in 2025. This price better aligns with the collector's edition, and it comes from probably the best source, and probably the most accurate one that I could find. The oldest information I've been able to access regarding Thracia's release and pricing is from SoftBank Games News, a now defunct subsidiary of IT Media, which is a Japanese media company which produces tech-related news. They have an article dated from July 13th of 1999, announcing that the original flashcart release of Thracia 776 would retail for 6,000 yen, which is a bit off of the Tsurugia JP price, so I actually have no idea where Tsurugia JP got that price. It might differ because I believe the price for the flashcart version is taking into account both the blank cart price and the download price, and those values may have varied a bit. Crucially though, their source for this information is Nintendo's official site, though unfortunately I cannot find an archive of the version of Nintendo's site which they link to, so I'm just taking them at their word here. The fact that the deluxe edition was announced alongside the flashcart release here again corresponds with an earlier release date for it, though again I cannot confirm an exact day of release. All of this brings me to the last mystery of the deluxe edition: how it was sold. Unlike the flashcart version where it was essentially downloaded at a Lawson's store, there's no definitive information about how one would obtain the deluxe edition. However, I think I have a pretty good idea. First, the SoftBank Games news article says that the deluxe edition was sold at Lawson's on a registration basis. I do believe that the deluxe edition would be sold at Lawson's since that was the only store where you could obtain the flashcart version. This brings me to my final piece of evidence. In this Twitter thread discussing the deluxe edition, Thracia fan artist Chada, who has been a Fire Emblem fan since before the original release of Thracia, remarks that they have fond memories of, quote, making reservations at Loppy for it. Loppy is a ticketing and early digital reservation system which is found at Lawson stores in Japan. If Chada is referring to the deluxe edition, then this means it was pre-ordered using a Loppy machine at Lawson's back in 1999. I reached out to them for clarification and to see if they have any more details about the deluxe edition, but they haven't been super active online lately due to personal reasons. If they do reply, I'll mention it on my Twitter or put it in the next part of the Iceberg. Regardless, I think I have managed to now put together a pretty good picture of the deluxe edition's release. It released either a couple days before or simultaneously with the flashcart release, and retailed for 9,800 yen, about 3,800 yen more than the flashcart release. Like the flashcart release, it was sold exclusively through Lawson's on a reservation basis. I think I have done more research on the Thracia Deluxe Edition than any human being really should at this point, but hopefully it was interesting. Okay, in this next entry I say Orson. Technically based on heroes, his name is Ocean.
I'm Ocean. I live with my dad in Fianna.
But I've been calling him Orson for years, so I'm keeping it that way. Vouge. The Vouge is Orson's personal weapon in Thracia, and it's one of the best weapons in the game since it has 1-2 range and high crit. But it actually has quite a history in the English community. Older translations refer to it as the Puji, based on its Japanese name. Newer translations call it the Vouge, which is a type of medieval pike or halberd. It's also been suggested that the Japanese name is a misspelling of Bouge, a type of knife with an axe-like blade. Berwick Saga and Vestaria Saga, which were both made by Shozo Kaga, the creator of Fire Emblem, both have a very similar weapon called Buji in Japanese. This leads me to believe that the Puji in Thracia is either misspelled or was changed slightly from its intended name reference for some reason. Because of the way Japanese works, Vouge and Bouge can both be rendered as Buji, so either etymology is possible. In Fire Emblem proper though, it is officially translated as the Vouge, as per Heroes.
And takes to the battlefield wielding his beloved axe, the Vouge.
Bonus entry. Attention all Thracia 776 gamers. Speaking of Thracia names being mispronounced, Muffin from Mars commissioned VoiceOver Pete, the guy behind those X Need Your Help memes, to produce this masterpiece, which really speaks for itself.
Attention, all Thracia 776 gamers. Leif Ferris Klaus needs your help. Reinhardt has epically taken children from Manster hostage. To rescue them, he's going to need warp staves and a Puji X. All Leif needs is your credit card number, the security code, and the expiration date. So may I say, thank you, and God bless Kauga.
Simply amazing. Shannon and FE4. In Fire Emblem 4, there's an event in Chapter 9 if you have the substitute character John or Hermina visit one of the villages. A man who has the same sprite as Shannon appears and claims that he is Shannon, but leaves in a hurry after he is exposed as a fake. Although it is never officially stated, this is incredibly similar to Shannon and Thracia. Both look a lot like Shannon, impersonate him, and hit on women. This would also make Shannon the only character first playable in Thracia to appear in FE4 first. It's also possible that the Thracia devs had this scene in mind when coming up with Shannon, though he is also just based on Samuel from FE3, who impersonates Navarre. Nana's parentage. While in Fire Emblem 4, Nana's father is whoever the player paired her mother Lachesis with in Part 1, in Thracia 776 she's named as the daughter of Finn. However, the official website for Thracia 776, in its earliest form, briefly said that her father was Beowulf from FE4, as seen through this archived page. And allegedly, Nana was able to wield the Beo sword in Thracia at one point in development, and the only characters who can wield it in-game are implied to be the children of Beowulf. But she can't wield it in the final game, which is a point against Beowulf being her father. There's also some evidence which suggests Finn is her actual father. In a frankly quite funny addition to this debate, when Nintendo sued Fire Emblem creator Shozo Kaga, which is a rabbit hole we'll get to much later on, Nana is named as Finn's daughter instead. So apparently by the time of the lawsuit, Nintendo had switched her father from Beowulf, as seen on the original site, to Finn. Non-canon works such as light novels and supplementary materials also give different answers for who Nana's father is. This just adds to the overall confusion of who the real father of Lachesis' kids is. The timeline for Nana's birth is also inconsistent. Thracia 776 illustrated work says that Nana was born the following year after Lachesis went to Leonster to live with Finn, making it possible Finn fathered her during this period. In contrast, Kaga's notes in Leonster's Fall, and don't worry, we'll get to those, say Lachesis was pregnant before and gave birth shortly after arriving in Leonster, which makes Finn being the father less likely. If you want a more thorough explanation of how different sources give contradictory or confusing information on Nana and her brother Diarmid's parentage, I suggest checking out Mark of the Asphodel's post on the topic on LiveJournal. Yeah, it was written a while ago, which is linked in the doc. So overall, there's a lot of contradictory information for whether Beowulf or Finn is Nana's biological father. I'd say there's still more leaning towards Beowulf being her father, but there's just enough evidence the other way that I could understand someone arguing for Finn instead. It's also possible, as some supplementary works suggest, that Finn isn't her biological father, but he has pretty much adopted her. And maybe this whole situation should be looked at from that angle. Do genetics actually matter when Finn has raised Nana her whole life? She certainly sees him as a father, so maybe that's good enough. The only direct evidence we have right now is the official website, which now doesn't list a father. So ultimately it's up to the player to decide which scenario they like, or how complicated they want Lachesis and Finn's love lives to be. Forced dismounting. Just like in Mystery of the Emblem, mounted units in Thracia can dismount, and they're forcibly dismounted on indoor sections of maps. A dismounted unit has slightly lowered stats, and unless they are a magic or bow class, they are also locked to swords, and they have a separate weapon level for swords when dismounted. There's still times when choosing to dismount might be a good idea, for example if there's a lot of enemies with cavalry or flying effective weaponry around. But it's also just a much needed nerf to cavalry after FE4. If someone didn't know about this mechanic, it could be quite strange to see Bryden, an Axe Knight, be unable to use his axe or horse in his joining chapter. The unit will also be forcibly dismounted if they're put to sleep, and this is the only way to capture a mounted unit. There's a pretty funny use of this mechanic in Chapter 8, where the boss is a Wyvern Rider who is dismounted. He will mount on turn 17, meaning you have 16 turns to capture him to access the Gaiden chapter after it, before he becomes uncapturable. That's one way to impose a soft turn limit, I guess. Trevant was right. This is a very much discussed point in both the game and among fans. While I wouldn't go so far as to say he is completely right, Thracia 776 does show that many of his actions are intended to benefit Thracia, and he also shares the goal of reuniting southern and northern Thracia with Quan and later Leif. It can even be argued that his killing of Quan and Ethlin, and the kidnapping of Altena, did in fact set in motion the events which would lead to the nation's reunion. Plus, in Thracia 776 we find out that Leif's father and grandfather banned the export of food to southern Thracia, which caused many southern Thracians to turn to banditry in order to feed themselves, and potentially caused people to starve. Leinster's Fall, and again we'll get to that later, also mentions that Manster had repeatedly invaded Thracia, so Trevant wasn't the only aggressor either. In an interview, Kage even said that, quote, "If he wasn't born in Thracia, he would have been a true hero." In another interview, Kage notes that, quote, "While Arvis's hand was forced by fate to some extent, that isn't the case for Travant. He was well aware of what he was doing. It's up to one to decide whether Travant and his circumstances are worthy of pity. As Lewin has said in Selph's chapter, there is more than one true justice. Travant's misguided actions were a result of him following his own sense of justice." Travant's voice lines in Fire Emblem Heroes also give him some nuance.
"We need that fertile northern land. My people are despised as hyenas by the very countries that force us to feed ourselves on battle. The mother was my enemy first. Now even the daughter despises me. The blood on my hands and the blood in her veins are the same. Let my people be tormented no longer. That is my only wish."
And in general, Heroes portrays him as a tough and merciless king, but one who cares deeply about his country and people. It's a very interesting contrast to his portrayal in FE4, where he is a much more black and white villain. Still, murder and kidnapping is probably bad, but I'm a Thracia fan, so my moral opinions are worth less than the average person's. Scroll stacking. So the Crusader Scrolls are items in Thracia 776, which change the growth rates of the character whose inventory they're in, and they also prevent criticals. On their own, they're already super useful for both of these things, but if you want to get really insane, you can put multiple scrolls on one character, as their growth rate effects stack. This means you can turn any unit in Thracia into a stat-capped super unit if you really want to, which is fun. Finn has PTSD. This entry refers to how Finn possibly has PTSD or some other mental health condition stemming from his experiences. It's rather common for soldiers to get some form of it, and Finn has seen a lot of combat over almost 2 decades at the start of Thracia, and he was deeply affected by the loss of Quan, Eflin, and Altena. In Chapter 16a, Leaf remarks that Finn hasn't cried or laughed in years, to which Dorius responds that Finn's heart is still in Leonster. Although we don't hear anything about this from Finn, these symptoms definitely hint at some sort of mental health problem stemming from his experiences. He also seems to have some form of survivor's guilt, though that's mostly shown in FE4, especially when he talks to Altena. He also seems to have had a rather messy relationship with Lachesis, based on his conversation with Selphina in Chapter 9, where she says that he doesn't know how to treat women, and that he let Lachesis walk away instead of supporting her more when she left to find her son Diarmid. And I'll get to that whole situation more later on in the Iceberg, but for now it's just important that Finn seems to struggle with interpersonal relationships since the Yid massacre as well, and this is especially true when dealing with women. On the other hand, he does seem genuinely happy to reunite with his friend Glade at least, but I still think he desperately needs a therapist, but unfortunately he's trapped in a medieval world where he can't even zone out while listening to Pink Floyd's The Wall. Capture baiting. This is a strategy which makes use of capturing and the enemy AI. It can make some of the most difficult chapters in Thracia, like Chapter 4, much easier. Basically, enemies will prioritize capturing a player unit who does not have any weapons. However, after doing so, they will have stat penalties from holding the captured unit. So, you can force enemies into capturing an unarmed unit and lowering their own stats, and then you can defeat them to get your unit back. Some characters, like Lara, make especially good bait for doing so. It's unknown if this strategy was intended by developers or not, but it's almost essential to learn how to do properly for higher ranked runs. Support bonuses. Thracia has a support system that's pretty much identical to the one that first appeared in Mystery of the Emblem, making it the second in the series to have a full support system. However, unlike later entries in the series, there are no tiers to supports or conversations to unlock. Instead, certain pairs of units come with inherent supports, although the base game doesn't show which ones, though some of them are pretty obvious, like of course Abel and Marita support each other. There are also 2 levels of supports, which give either a 10 or 20% bonus to hit/avoid and crit/crit avoid. The higher bonuses are much rarer. Supports can be one-sided, where only one character derives benefit, and again mutual supports are rarer. Some supports can actually be higher on one end than the other too, like Glade not being quite as supportive of his wife as his wife is to him. Some of the support pairs are interesting too. It's cute that Nana and Leaf have a mutual support, and that Marita gives a high support bonus to Galzus. Reinhardt and Olwen also have a support, which is the only enemy player unit support in the game where the enemy cannot be recruited. It's a nice touch and also a little sad considering it only activates if they fight near each other. Also, fun fact, a unit will not counterattack a unit who supports them. This is why Abel doesn't attack Merida in Chapter 5, and why if you attack Xavier with Leaf in Chapter 18, he won't fight back. Official site. Nintendo of Japan still has the official website for Thracia 776 up, and it was made before the game even came out, and it's barely even been updated since that time. It's only in Japanese, though you can Google Translate it with mixed results. It still has that wonderful early internet look to it. It has some interesting information, including listing characters' official ages and parents. It also has full maps for every chapter, including the Fog of War ones. Though they don't show enemy information, each map comes with a bit of strategy advice which a new player might find pretty helpful. There's also info on weapons and items, but some don't give any info, leaving it up to the player to find this out for themselves. It even still has some unused items listed, like the Killer Ballista and Gungnir, neither of which appear in the actual game. The screenshots of the game on the website also appear to be from a beta version of the game, as some character classes are slightly different, and the art is all strangely washed out. Also, while this isn't on the Iceberg, the same is true of the manual, where Leaf appears in the Junior Lord class, which he is never in the final game. This site is a really great time capsule that I'm glad Nintendo has kept up all these years, but I hope it's archived well for when Nintendo inevitably decides to stop paying for a website for an obscure game they released back in 1999. Official art. There are several sources of official art for Thracia 776, most of which is done by the late Mayumi Hiroda. She was first hired to do the art for the Fire Emblem art book, Fire Emblem Treasure, and Shozo Kaga was quite impressed with her work. He said that her art perfectly encapsulated his vision for the juvenile games, and he brought her on as the official artist for Thracia 776. The two would continue to work together until Hiroda's untimely death in 2018. As for the official sources of art, not including the TCGs or Fire Emblem Heroes, first is the game manual and Nintendo of Japan's website, both of which contain character artwork of the playable cast and some of the villains and important NPCs. There is also the Thracia 776 Illustrated Works art book, which was released in 2000. It features character portraits and artwork depicting events from the game, including painted versions of the credit CGs. The painted work is done by Hiroda, while the character portraits in it are actually done by Sachiko Wada. This was some of Sachiko Wada's earliest work for the series, and she would contribute a lot to the series going forwards, most notably as the director and artist for the Sacred Stones. Illustrated Works also contains some character bios and game information too. The first 47 pages, which is the character bios, have been translated by the Sai Shyster, and a link to that is in the doc. He also plans on translating the rest, so hopefully we'll see the whole thing soon. Finally, there's a series of picture postcards featuring original art by Hiroda, though information about these is scarce. Like all Thracia 776 media, these were all only released in Japan. There's also some miscellaneous art like the Blowin' in the Wind single cover, also by Hiroda. Personally, I really like when games have art books and the like, especially for older games. It really helps show what can't be shown in the video game. As good as Thracia's sprites are, it's always cool to see characters outside of pixel art. Hiroda's art does a great job conveying the world of Thracia and its characters, and I don't think the game would be the same without it. Also, Hiroda would later do the art for Tearing Saga, and allegedly some art for Visteria Saga as well. These are some of the games that Kaga made after leaving Nintendo. Visteria Saga's character design is attributed to one Asbel. Mayumi Hiroda's original Thracia artwork would be exhibited at the official Fire Emblem Expo in 2019, which ended up being a great posthumous tribute to her. May she rest in peace. Gios. This entry refers to a concept mentioned in Abel's epilogue in Thracia. It says that she regained her memory after her Gios with the dragons expired. Gios is one of those references to Celtic mythology in the game I mentioned earlier. In Celtic mythology, Gios is a magical pact given by a divine or spiritual entity, which involves a taboo or restriction placed on a person that can also bring great power if the recipient follows the terms of the Gios. For example, the hero Cuchulainn has multiple gyasa, one which prohibits him from eating dog meat, and another which binds him to eat any food offered to him by a woman. When a woman offers him dog meat, he is forced to violate one of these, which leads to his death. Although we don't get much information in-game, Gyas seems to work similarly in Thracia. Presumably, Eivill's Gyas involved the loss of her memory, though we don't exactly know what dragons gave it to her or why. I would perhaps guess that Oler, her ancestor dragon, gave it to her, and perhaps the term was to allow her to survive after the events of Fire Emblem 4. Also, though it relates more to Fire Emblem 4, Lewin in Part 2 of that game as well as in Thracia seems to be under a Gyas too. The dragons in FE4 and 5 seem to prefer to deal in these Gyasa when they interact with people rather than interacting with them directly. American Kemph. Infamously, in the Shia patch, Kemph utters the line, "Those idiots have fallen right into my trap. In America!" This is most likely a reference to a running joke in Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged.
What are you doing? Asking for help's illegal. In America.
We don't know exactly why the line's there, but I've heard theories that it was either a joke accidentally left in the patch, or Shia just needed a line to trigger the next scripted event, and they went with whatever came to mind. Regardless, this, combined with Shia Kemph calling Olin a stupid bitch, has become one of the biggest memes of Thracia 776 in the English community. Kemph's Heroes English BA has even referenced this meme, though sadly they have not recorded it. Kemph's mimetic godhood is rivaled only by Reinhardt, which oddly enough fits their in-game dynamic, and he has even beaten Reinhardt in the Choose Your Legends poll before. Manga adaptations. Thracia has some associated manga, none of which have ever been released officially outside of Japan. I want to give a huge shout out to the Fire Emblem library. It's basically a repository of Fire Emblem materials, including art books, guidebooks, manga, etc. It started when Kitsudori had the idea for a Jupro library, and then Mina 776 helped expand it to include materials for the entire series. For each material, there's a lot of useful information, like any authors or artists, and its current scan and translation status. They're seeking contributors to upload Fire Emblem materials that aren't on there yet, so if you want to contribute, you should check out the Discord. This site made this entry way easier. If I don't specify where you can find any of the manga I talk about or their translations, it's on the Fire Emblem library. Onto the manga proper, there's two primary manga adaptations of Thracia. The first is an adaptation of the game story by Yuna Takanagi, and it had 3 volumes. It covers chapters 1 to 14 of the game, with a prologue chapter detailing the fall of Leonster as well. It's currently being translated by Kitsudori, and the first 4 chapters in the prologue have been translated so far. The second adaptation is a 1-volume manga by Hino Shinosuke, which covers chapters 1 to 4X. It's not translated, but the Japanese scans are out there. Sadly, there's no complete adaptation of Thracia in manga form. But if you want some short stories and extra comics, there's actually a lot of those. First, Enix published 2 volumes of Thracia 776 4-kama, which feature humorous 4-panel comics of Thracia by a variety of artists. They're pretty great, though I have no idea what's happening in some of these. The first volume is readily available online, but the second one is actually lost media currently. According to the Lost Media Wiki and what people have told me personally, copies are out there, but it just hasn't been scanned and put online yet. Enix also released a volume of their Super Comic Theater anthology series focusing on Thracia 776, and it's a series of short stories by various authors, some serious and some less so. Intelligent Systems themselves released some Thracia anthology manga in collaboration with publisher Kobunsha. First, there's the Thracia 776 4-comic gag battle, which is also a series of 4-panel comics by various authors. They're pretty much identical in content to the Enix 4-kama, but some of these ones have actually been translated by Advent, and they're available on his Twitter. From what I've seen, they're great. These have 2 volumes, and then there's also the Kobunsha Thracia 776 comic anthology, which also has 2 volumes. It has short stories by a variety of authors, some serious and some not so serious. If you haven't realized it yet, Enix and Kabucha seem to release the exact same Thracia side comics around the same time. It's wild to imagine there was once competition between Thracia 776 comic producers. Anyways, Kabucha also released the Kombucha short comics, yet another anthology comic, this time with 1 volume. Finally, there's Fire Emblem, Military History of the Continent, which was another short story anthology manga of 1 volume, this time published by Bros Comics. It has stories revolving around both FE4 and FE5. Obviously none of these manga are canon, but they have some pretty interesting interpretations of the games, and I've always liked seeing the cast of video games outside of the game. There's also a bunch of FE4 manga, some of which feature a lot of Thracia content, but if I covered those we'd be here all day. One last thing I want to mention is there's also a Thracia doujinshi by the video game Yaoi Dojinshi Circle Nobaral Kota, which is definitely something. That's not official, but when else am I going to talk about this? I mean, look at this, it's top tier. Also, yes, the circle is named after Navarre from the Arcanea games. You may be a Fire Emblem fan, but are you hardcore enough of a fan to name your Yaoi group after a Fire Emblem character? There's other Thracia doujins out there too, including this red one I have actually bought and I'll upload it when I get it, but I've already ranted about this for way too long. Let's move on to the next tier. Unconfirmed prototype. This entry refers to unconfirmed prototype information of very dubious origin, first posted on Fire Emblem Universe in 2008. Allegedly, it originates from the daughter of a programmer who worked on FE4 and 5 and 6, although again none of this has ever been confirmed, and I personally don't put too much stock into this information because of just how uncertain it is. There's absolutely no proof provided, and it also comes pretty much third hand. If this were released today, it would be immediately discarded as fake, and honestly it gives big "my uncle works for Nintendo" energy. However, I put it on here because I will refer to it later when discussing speculative or prototype information. I'll link to the Serenus Forest page on it in the doc. I think it's a very interesting relic of what the FE community was like back in the day, where this kind of speculation in general was rampant. Some of the info was plausible based on what we know now, like Ishtar originally making an appearance as an enemy at some point, some additional units from FE4 appearing, and a cut playable character called Gunna. That last one is interesting because I don't think the existence of a cut character called Gunna appearing in the game's code was widely known back then, so perhaps the person did have some deep level knowledge about the game somehow. Others are pretty out there though, like Arian killing Dean for his relationship with Lenoan, and Ira being Marita's mother, which is very unlikely given Marita's real backstory in the final game. That one just feels like someone speculating based on Marita's similarity to Ira. It's worth noting that the same source also gave alleged info about FE4 and 6. Their FE4 claims are especially unbelievable, like Laucasus being Ares' mother originally, and Seliph and Julia becoming lovers automatically. But for all of these crazy bits that I have a hard time believing they ever even fully considered, much less made it as far as the prototype stage, there's the occasional tidbit which does make sense or is supported by cut code, like the Gunna thing I mentioned earlier, or Gale being recruitable in FE6. My best guess is that this person did have some kind of access to certain information, or was an early hacker, so they could put in some real details about the game's development to give the whole thing legitimacy, but then sprinkled in their own ideas alongside the real information. You see this a lot with fake game leaks, where real information is included with the fake stuff to give it more legitimacy. That's just my theory though. For all we know, they could be 100% legit and recruitable Reinhardt was a thing in the FE5 prototype. Chapter 9 Roadblock Strat. In Chapter 9 of Fire Emblem 5, you can actually manipulate the enemies to the south into going all the way around the mountain instead of straight forward. If the entire right side is blocked like so, they will instead go around. It's a pretty funny example of how you can manipulate enemy AI in Thracia. Salem Thera support bonus. Another quick one, there was a rumor that Thera and Salem only get a support bonus in the game if they talk in Chapter 16b. This would be the only support in the game triggered by a conversation, and also the first one like it in the series. However, they actually have the support from the start, and the conversation doesn't do anything gameplay-wise. If I had to guess, this arose because people assumed their conversation had to have some effect. But nope, it's just extra story info. Super Thracia. This is an infamous ROM hack of Thracia that is honestly deserving of its own video. But in short, it is a Japanese hack by Lin Lin, which, while it keeps the maps generally the same as the base game, it drastically alters enemy and player units in gameplay. Its creator described it as having rough difficulty, which is a huge understatement. In other words, this is what's known as a Kaizo hack, a hack designed to make you suffer. Lin Lin also says they never playtested it, and that they don't take any responsibility for physical or mental damage caused by playing it, so that's reassuring to hear. It's also designed to be played with save state abuse apparently. This hack takes an already decently difficult game and makes it absolutely absurd, including invisible enemies, complete enemy spam, a maze map with fog of war, and an enemy staff in endgame which straight up deletes your units. Also, the final boss is actually 6 units all stacked on top of each other, all with capped stats of course. It also has some other changes, like introducing 3rd tier promotions, raising the cap for most stats from 20 to 40, and my personal favorite, replacing Paragon mode with Renegade mode, which halves XP gain instead of doubling it. This is the game a lot of people think Thracia 776 is. I will say though, the custom sprites made for the hack are really good. I really like Leaf's sprite in particular. The story hasn't been translated, but it's apparently some kind of crossover between different FE games, so if you want to see Arden and Oliver in the same game, here you are. It also prominently features Claus, who I'm sure you know well as the character who only appears in one of the unfinished Fire Emblem 1 manga. I also want to give a shout out to Blade of Light's Super Thracia guide, which is pretty much essential if you want to try it out for yourself. There's also an English menu patch by Miakis which makes it easier to play. It also comes with a 0% growth option if you really hate yourself. Ghost Couch did a great overview of the series if you want to get a feel for this hack without risking your own sanity. I'll leave a link to all of these in the doc as well. Authority Stars. This is another mechanic in Thracia that isn't quite as well known as things like capturing, but it's still pretty important at times. Basically, some units have authority stars, and when that unit is deployed, each star gives a 3% hit avoid bonus to all deployed units on that side. The number of authority stars a unit has corresponds with their importance as a leader, so for example, important bosses like Reinhardt or Kemp have some, and important characters like Finn or Xavier have one since they're leaders among the Leonster army. Leaf's authority stars are actually tied to Augustus and Dorius. Leaf starts with 0 stars, and then he gains 1 each for when Augustus and Dorius are with him. He then loses Dorius' authority star, giving him 1 total from chapter 19 onwards. These are nice little narrative touches where you can subtly feel the relative command certain characters have in the gameplay. It's just another example of Thracia generally integrating its story and mechanics really well. Authority stars are a nice little bonus most of the time, but they can drastically affect gameplay in a few chapters. Reinhardt has 5 authority stars, which adds a bit of a challenge to chapter 22. But most notably, in chapter 17a, Sias will appear as an enemy on turn 10 with 10 authority stars, giving a massive 30% hit avoid bonus to all enemies for the next 5 turns until he leaves. I love how this chapter turns a small mechanic into a notable map feature, even if it makes me cry while playing it. Also, sadly, if you recruit him, he only keeps 3 of those authority stars, which is still 2 more than said, but then you don't get Forseti. It's a difficult choice. Bonus entry: Sias recruitment conditions. Speaking of Sias, there's actually some misinformation about his recruitment conditions out there. I know, wrong info about Thracia 776 on the internet? Insane. Anyways, it's still common to see Sias' recruitment conditions in Thracia to be listed as just not recruit Ced in Chapter 23, but that's not completely true. To recruit him at the end of the chapter, not only did Ced have to not be recruited, but all of the civilian units around him in the chapter have to be alive. If any of them die, he will leave, potentially leaving you with neither Ced or Sias. I've actually seen people get confused as to why Sias dipped on them when they didn't recruit Ced, because a lot of sites don't mention this requirement. Guidebooks. This entry actually has two parts. First is just the fact that there are official guidebooks for Thracia. Once again, they're not really available online or in English. I could find evidence of three. The Fire Emblem Thracia 776 Perfect Guidebook, the Nintendo Official Guidebook, and the Capture Guidebook. These all released around the same time as the game did in late 1999. I really like how the Nintendo Official Guidebook continues with the tradition of the soundtrack release of just having a random stock art of vaguely ancient buildings on the cover instead of anything from the game. From what's available online, these are just standard video game strategy guides, including character information and stats, maps, and explanations of mechanics. I don't have any of them, at least right now, so I can't really vouch for how good the advice is. Some FE guidebooks can have some questionable advice, but at least the map info and character stats are always nice. The game itself also came with a 72-page instruction manual explaining mechanics as well. While writing this Iceberg initially, I had to rely on my limited Japanese and Google Translate for that, but fortunately since then Advent has released a full English translation of the manual, linked in the doc. Now for the second part of this entry we have, believe it or not, more Thracia misinformation. There was this old rumor that Thracia 776 was made purposefully obtuse or difficult in order to sell more guidebooks. This has been pretty thoroughly debunked by Miakis on Twitter, and I'll link her thread on it in the doc. In short, this comes from a mistranslation of an interview with Shozukaga. Online he says it has been mistranslated and circulated as saying, quote, "If you don't look in guidebooks, you won't find special tips, hidden events, or hidden items." What the line actually says, however, is, quote, "The game will not employ tricks, hidden events, or hidden items that aren't understood without looking at the strategy guide." That literally means the exact opposite of what was circulating for years. Also, as Miakis points out, Nintendo of Japan has and continues to maintain a pretty thorough free website for the game that explains mechanics and even has map information and strategy advice. The 72-page game manual also came with all copies of the game, even the flashcard version ones, so if they really wanted to just sell more guidebooks, they wouldn't be giving out so much free information and advice from the start. Theme of Love. This is an obscure song from the official Thracia OST. It is a remix of the Theme of Love from Mystery of the Emblem. And in the sound room and on the official soundtrack releases, it is called In the Chapter, Sorrow. It only plays if Nana dies in Chapter 5 before you open the door to get her. Upon Leaf reaching Abel, this song will play as they grieve. It's a great callback to Mystery of the Emblem, and it's one of the best songs from Thracia in my opinion. Also, there's actually several different dialogue outcomes depending on if Abel is captured or not in this scene, and if Nana is alive or not. You can see the differences on screen. Murder Hollis. This entry refers to an infamous mistranslation of Chapter 11X of Thracia's title. Siro-san, the creator of Project Exile, summarized it really well in his notes. And fortunately, Louis, one of the creators of the other Thracia Iceberg, has contributed a reading of it to this video, so I'll just let him take it away.
Pardon my French, but this was a goddamn mess. The SF title, Murder Hollis, was laughable. I'm gonna try to break down what happened here. First, there was the transpositional error in the game itself. Designer tried to write murder holes phonetically, but transcribed holes slightly incorrectly. This was misread by the SF translator as Hollis, and from there, I honestly don't know what happened. I've left it in their translation notes below, but for whatever reason, they concluded that Murder Hollis was to trap yourself and the enemy in a single room and fight them to the death. Problem is, Hollis isn't a word. The Oxford English Dictionary, the definitive record of the English language, has no record of it. Common online dictionaries have no record of it. It is, quite simply, not a word. And I have no idea what logic led the translators to conclude that it referred to some kind of Sun Tzu-esque desperate ground notion.
Thank you, Louis. Check out his channel in the doc. What makes this error especially funny is that a murder hole is an actual term for a hole in a fortification for shooting arrows or throwing projectiles through. And that's exactly what happens in the chapter. This translation is also confirmed in Fire Emblem Engage. I don't know how that didn't occur to somebody for years, but at least now we can look back at it and laugh. It's also something of a meme to ask who Hollis is in Fire Emblem and who murdered him. FE4 characters and files. Although obviously some characters are shared between FE4 and 5, such as Leaf and Seliph, there is some unused data in the files of Thracia which shows that some additional FE4 characters were planned to make an appearance at some point in development. In particular Arthur, and the substitute characters Asaello, Daisy, John, and who is possibly Hermina, all have portraits in the files. The substitute characters appearing is especially interesting because it could have given us an idea of what they are doing if not recruited in FE4, and honestly they fit in more with Thracia's cast than genealogies. The unconfirmed prototype also says that Hawk would be playable along with the ones above, but again that is completely unconfirmed. Many Thracia ROM hacks make some or all of these unused characters playable as well. Fergus is Beowulf's son. Fergus's epilogue says that he is rumored to be the son of Beowulf from FE4. There is some merit to this idea in-game, because he can wield the Beo sword, which by its name seems to only be used by Beowulf and his descendants. The only other character who can use this is Diarmid, which potentially makes Fergus and Diarmid at least half-siblings. Fergus's epilogue also hints that he might be part of the royal family of Connaught, one of the kingdoms of northern Thracia. And much later on in the Iceberg we'll talk more about Connaught, but for now I just like the idea that Beowulf, this random mercenary, got with both Lachesis and some other royal from Connaught as well. Merida learning Astra. In Chapter 15 of Thracia, there's a secret event where Merida can learn the skill Astra from Shannon when he appears on turn 11 at the top of the map. It's a pretty funny scene where Shannon, pretending to be Shannon, tries to bluff his way into teaching her Astra at her request, and he's stupefied when she actually does learn it from his generic advice. Of course, she can learn it because of her odd holy blood, but she might not even know about that. I've always found it to be an incredibly funny idea in the Juke Rule games that skills are somehow genetic. Barat. Barat is the boss of Chapter 20 of Thracia 776, and there's several notable things about him. The first is that he holds the Thread Scroll, so if you want to get a crit on him or have the scroll you have to steal it first. The second is that he has a hidden skill which makes him immortal for the first 3 turns of the map, so you can't just immediately warp someone in and kill him. He is also statistically identical to Wolf, the boss from Chapter 19, down to both having 4 authority stars. Lastly, he has a quote programmed for if you capture and release him, but this is impossible to get in-game because he has 20 constitution, so even mounted units can't capture him. Overall, he's just kind of a weird boss. Also, while older translations give him the name Barat, spelled B-H-A-R-A-T, which is Indian in origin, Fire Emblem Heroes spells it differently, instead B-A-R-A-T-H, and gives him a name of Hungarian origin. I prefer the older translation because there's actually a movement to rename India to Bharat, which is an indigenous name for the country instead of the Latin-derived India. And although it's a complete coincidence, the idea of a country sharing a name with a random Thracia boss is funny to me, especially because veteran Thracia players in the English community know him best for his corrupted and incomprehensible dialogue in the Shia patch. Truly an eloquent foe. Bonus entry. Enemy Berserk target glitch. I don't know why I forgot to put this on the Iceberg proper, but this is a good place for it for reasons you'll see. I'm not a computer person at all, so I'm just going off what the good Fire Emblem wiki and Thracia hacking legend I say, but basically there's a glitch, or more accurately an oversight, that can make certain non-berserked enemies target other enemies with status staves. This happens due to the way the game checks targets for status staves. In the code, enemies don't actually check their own status, like if they're berserked, to determine who they target with a status stave, but rather the first unit on their side in the game's memory. Most of the time this first unit is the chapter boss who cannot be targeted by status staves because they're on a throne, but in a few chapters it's a different unit. If you berserk this first unit, then the enemy unit with a status staff will act as if they themselves are berserked. They will then target their own side with their status staves. And they can actually target and hit bosses on thrones, which as I demonstrates allows for Raedric and Vel to get berserked. You normally can't hit bosses on thrones with status staves, so this is the only way to do it. There's a bit more to this glitch, which you can find on the Fire Emblem wiki if you're interested. But basically, yeah, the way enemy status staff use is coded can be exploited to do some otherwise impossible things. This glitch/oversight also means that berserking an enemy with a status staff won't make them target enemies, since their targeting depends on the status of the first unit. This is much more likely to happen on a regular playthrough, so it's useful to know before you try to tease any old map with a berserk staff. Chapters 18 and 20 through endgame are known to have different first units than bosses on thrones, so you can exploit this glitch on all of them. And guess who the first unit in chapter 20 is, who can be berserked to exploit this glitch? That's right, Barat. Class power. This entry refers to a hidden mechanic used in experience gain calculations in Thracia. Different classes have different levels of class power, which determines the experience they get during battle. I'll put the calculations up on screen, but basically it ensures that less combat-inclined units get more experience from battle, and stronger classed enemies get more experience. Leaf and Smash. It is often spread around that Leaf was originally considered for Super Smash Bros. Melee instead of Roy, but he was scrapped so they could instead market the then upcoming Binding Blade, and because Masahiro Sakurai liked the idea of a character with fire-based attacks more. However, I cannot find an official source that states this, and it seems to be a rumor which started from a debunked NeoGAF post. If this idea was thrown around, it never entered official development. Many characters who were considered and cut for Smash have been mentioned by Smash developers in various interviews, but Leaf is never brought up. In fact, in Smash creator Masahiro Sakurai's interview about Fire Emblem and Smash for the 25th anniversary book, The Making of Fire Emblem, he goes into detail about how Marth and Roy were added to Smash. He doesn't mention them considering any other character for Smash 64 or Melee, so it seems Roy and Melee was always the plan. Leaf was an option in the official 1999 Melee poll of characters people wanted to see in the upcoming game. However, he was beaten out by both Seliph and Sigurd, so I think those two were more likely to be considered if anything. It is possible, but still pretty unlikely, that he was considered as a trophy in Melee, since Sakurai has said that Fire Emblem trophies were cut from Melee during development. That being said, Leaf is referenced in Melee, as one of Marth's alternate costumes is based on his outfit in Thracia. Sadly, this costume has been replaced in new Super Smash Bros. Entries, and now the only Thracia 776 representation in Smash Ultimate is Leaf appearing as a spirit. In his spirit battle, he is represented by Roy in his pink alternate costume. Also in this fight, he heals HP over time, which could be a reference to the Light Brand doubling as a healing item in Thracia. Moreover, he randomly unleashes critical hits, which could be a reference to the FCM hidden stat, which is on this iceberg in the next tier. Also, Leaf should be in Smash as a fighter because it would be really funny. I mean, god, the week that Byleth was announced for Smash was the greatest time in my life. I didn't even need to eat for the whole week, I just lived off the tears of Smash fanboys. Imagine if they put Leaf in. Gomez. Gomez is the boss of Chapter 8X, and he's infamously frustrating to fight. He's relatively early in-game, but he has a whopping 22 defense and 46 HP, along with 14 speed. Pretty much no physical unit can consistently do damage to him. Even strong physical units like Dagdar have pretty shaky hit rates because he's on a throne. That also means he heals up HP every turn. Oh, he can also kill almost any unit you leave in range, either by accident or because you couldn't see him through the fog. I think he isn't too bad if you've played Thracia before. As long as you bring Asbel with Graf Caliber, he's pretty easy to kill. But if you're going in blind, he can be a real pain. Some people have also said that he should be counted as a Camus archetype, since he's turned back to banditry and betrayed Dagdar just to keep himself and others from starving. This leads to Leif's conversation with August about the food scarcity of southern Thracia and his kingdom's complicity in it, which is probably my favorite scene in the game. 24X. Moving on from an infamous boss, we have an infamous chapter. This Gaiden chapter is right before the endgame, and it's your chance to rescue Abel, which means it's very narratively satisfying. However, it is not easy. It's full of warping dark mages, some of whom have hell, and endless reinforcements. It's most remembered, though, for having certain unmarked tiles which warp a unit to the bottom room of the screen, where they can only get out via a warper rescue staff. That chamber has strong enemies in it, of course. And since it's an escape chapter after 21X, that means if a unit is left behind, they're treated as dead. Let me really emphasize that. Your units can get randomly teleported to a death chamber, as the game itself says. When people say staff users are absolutely necessary in Thracia, this chapter is why. I actually cannot imagine playing this map without a few A-rank staff users and copious warp, rescue, sleep, and silence staves. And good luck if you're playing blind. But at the same time, this is also the beauty of Thracia. It's insane, but when you succeed, it's so satisfying. Also, like most things in Thracia, you can actually mostly trivialize this whole chapter with the right setup. You're going to want to warp in a strong unit like Sadr Golzis to the center, and immediately take out the boss, which means you don't have to deal with getting berserked. Then, keep that unit on the escape tile. The rewarped mages will all flock around them, and with the avoid bonus from the escape tile, they should be able to deal with the annoying reinforcements without much trouble. Or you can silence and put to sleep the bishops in the death chamber, so that they can't use warp and you don't have to deal with the reinforcements from the chamber. Or you can just exploit the game as Kaga intended. You see, the warp tiles only activate after a unit uses the wait command on a tile. So if you rescue, drop a unit, use an item or a staff, etc., you won't get warped. So towards the end with all the warp tiles, you can just make a giant rescue chain and just ensure that no one is ending a turn with the wait command. So you do still have a lot of options, especially if you've been playing halfway intelligently and you have the resources for it. Still one of the worst maps in the game. Novelizations. Thracia actually has 2 official light novels based on it, and unlike the manga, they're actually complete adaptations. Which makes sense since novels are way denser than manga. The first is written by Takashi Umemura and illustrated by Mitsuki Shina. It has 2 volumes. Fortunately, this one is readily available to read in English, complete with illustrations, due to the amazing work of Leif of Leonster translations. I'd recommend giving it a read because it includes both an extended prologue detailing Leif's life before the game, and a really cute ending scene which I won't spoil. Of course, the link to it is in the doc. The second novel adaptation is written by Shinosaki Sami and illustrated by Hino Shinosuke, who you may remember from earlier in the Iceberg as the author of a manga based on the game. It has 3 volumes, but there's not too much information available about this one online. Fortunately, Leif of Leonster Translations has given some info about it, and hopefully they'll translate it someday. No pressure though, they're already working at an insane pace to translate all of the Fire Emblem light novels. This one apparently goes through the events of Fire Emblem 5, and then incorporates a lot of the endgame of Fire Emblem 4 that takes place after the events of Fire Emblem 5 too. And then the third volume is all short stories relating to Fire Emblem 4 and 5. And they sound pretty interesting to me, so I'd love to read them if I ever get better at Japanese, or if they ever get translated. What I find so interesting about video game, manga, and light novels is that they're all essentially officially sanctioned fanfiction, and it's fun to see an author's take on the game, like Takashi Umemura really liking Orson, as one should. Wrath plus Vantage. The Wrath and Vantage skills in Thracia would be insane together, given that you could get the guaranteed crit counterattacks while attacking first on enemy phase, essentially creating a completely unstoppable killing machine. The developers of Thracia seem to have anticipated this, however, and if you put both on a unit, then Wrath doesn't work. Well, except for if the enemy also has Vantage, which instead cancels out the Vantage and then only Wrath activates. So technically you can have both skills, just not in the same round of combat. I can imagine a player who doesn't know this getting confused and annoyed when their plan for a murder machine doesn't work, but I like that the devs thought about it, and it's understandable why they prevented this combo. But despite this, the Bayo sword gives both Wrath and Vantage for some reason, but it still doesn't work, so that's kind of a funny oversight or just a weird decision. Or maybe they didn't actually mean to have the skills not work together. Who knows? Thracia 776 was intended to be smaller. This entry refers to the idea that Thracia was intended as a small side project, rather than the full-blown game it turned into. As I said previously, Thracia was first released for the Nintendo Power Flashcart service. According to the official Nintendo Power Flashcart site, the idea seems to have been that you could put up to 7 games on one cart. Thracia, however, takes up all the space on one cart, which kind of defeats one of the main perks of the system. This doesn't confirm it was meant to be smaller though, since some other full-scale games were released on the flashcart service towards the end of the Super Famicom's lifespan, pretty much just so they didn't take up space on store shelves over N64 games. But combined with the fact that it is a midquel, it's possible that Thracia was intended to be a smaller scale Fire Emblem game, maybe something along the lines of BS Fire Emblem, but it became larger as more ideas were added. This is somewhat confirmed in an interview Kaga did for Nintendo Online Magazine in 1999. He says, translated by Google Translate, quote, "I started working on Thracia 776 around the beginning of last year. At first, I didn't intend to make such a big production. It was supposed to be something smaller, like a spin-off of Genealogy of the Holy War. The production period was also supposed to be shorter. As I was making it, I wanted to include more and more things." He also gives the example of how the rescue mechanic then led to the idea of being able to put units in places they normally wouldn't be able to reach. To me, this sounds like Thracia was intended to be more of a side project, but Kaga and the other developers kept adding more into it until it became a full-fledged game. However, this statement is perhaps contradicted by what Shozo Kaga said in April 1999 on the Intelligent Systems forum. There, he estimated that the upcoming game would have 35 to 40 maps, with around 20 in one playthrough. This indicates that by the spring of 1999, Thracia had already been expanded to a much longer game, if it was made to be shorter originally. I don't think we'll ever know more about Thracia's development than we do currently, since no one involved seems keen to speak on it. Which leaves us with only these two comments by Shozo Kaga and some speculation. But with what we do know of Thracia's development, it was pretty troubled, so I wouldn't be surprised if the game was made longer than originally intended, which could explain its very late release date. Kaga's first post about Thracia 776 gave it a tentative release date of spring of 1999, earlier than its eventual fall 1999 release date. This corroborates his comment about how the development timeline should have been shorter. So I'll leave it up to you to decide if this theory is true. It would explain some of the peculiarities of Thracia's development and release, but that doesn't necessarily make it true. Diarmuid and Nana only have siblings. As explained in the previous tier, Nana's father, either Beowulf or Finn, is pretty hotly debated among Thracia fans. Diarmid, on the other hand, is definitely Beowulf's son. He comes with Beowulf's sword, and is one of only 2 units who can use it, and the other is implied to be Beowulf's son. While in Fire Emblem 4 split parentage is impossible for Generation 2 characters, in Thracia it could be possible that Diarmid is Beowulf's child and Nanna is Finn's, definitely in spirit but also maybe biologically, which would make them only half-siblings. It definitely raises some questions about Lachesis' relationship with both potential fathers. And let's not forget Beowulf's lover conversation with Lachesis in Chapter 5 of FE4, where he says he knows she's in love with someone else and she could go to Leonster. If he's referring to Finn, and I believe he is based on something I'll get to in a second, then the Thracia devs could have taken this conversation and used it as the basis for Diarmid and Nanna in Thracia. This wouldn't be the only time Thracia has taken things vaguely hinted in FE4 and made them more explicit. Also, I've seen it said that the Fire Emblem 20th Anniversary Encyclopedia confirms that Diarmid and Nanna are full siblings, but after I finally tracked down the pages which mention it in the encyclopedia, that really isn't the case. It mentions that Nanna calls Finn father in FE4 and 5 in the sense of him raising her, even if he isn't paired with Lachesis. This can be seen as hinting towards Finn not being her biological father, as I discussed in the entry on Nanna's parentage earlier, but it doesn't outright say he isn't her father biologically either. It also points out Beowulf's lover conversation with Lachesis to note that it is intriguing. I think this inclusion is very much implying that Beowulf is referring to Finn in this conversation as the person Lachesis has feelings for, so that could mean that Finn and Lachesis were intended to have some kind of relationship even if you pair Lachesis with Beowulf. So if anything, that just kind of hints towards this half-sibling theory. But it could also be saying that Finn is just Nanna's adopted father. So it doesn't really confirm or deny anything related to Nanna's father. I think this half-sibling theory is getting more and more popular though. The Thracia hack for Seti's Cut used it, for example. But in summary, as it stands, Thracia confirms that Diarmid is Beowulf's son, and Nanna is the adoptive daughter of Finn, and is the biological daughter of either Beowulf or Finn. Cake Attack's playthrough. Back in 2012, a Something Awful forums user named Cake Attack did a text let's play of Thracia. The way these worked, people would post screenshots and summaries of their playthroughs chapter by chapter along with their thoughts. And then people in the thread could vote on, for example, which unit got a scroll or promotion, or who to deploy in chapters. Back in the day, text playthroughs on forums like this were actually a pretty big way people learned about Japanese exclusive games. Danganronpa first gained an English-speaking fanbase through a similar playthrough, for example. Cake Attack uses the Shia patch, so the game was translated in this case, but this playthrough definitely introduced some people on the English side of the internet, or people who weren't already hardcore Fire Emblem fans, to the game. He explains a lot about how the game works, including giving his thoughts and characters, and explaining some of the calculations in the game. They fall a bit into the early 2010s FE player mindset of hating pre-promotes, but honestly for how old this playthrough is, it's still a decent guide, and Cake Attack gets pretty much all the special events. It also spawned some of the more noteworthy Thracia memes, including the Marty Party and Penta-Axe General. It's linked in the doc if you want to check it out. It's a pretty important piece of Thracia fan history that a lot of people don't really know about. Misha is Dithorba's daughter. In her death quote, Misha mentions her mother, Dithorba. Players of FE4 may remember that Dithorba was one of the 4 Heavenly Knights of Celeste in that game, who was killed by Sigurd's forces in Chapter 4 after allying with Myos and Dakar against Queen Lana of Celeste. In Chapter 17a of Thracia, Nikolov mentions this while talking with Misha as well, asking if that is why she is fighting for the Empire, which Misha denies. I think Misha being the daughter of a minor villain from FE4 adds to the overall theme in Thracia of people from all kinds of backgrounds fighting for what is right. It's also a nice bit of continuity, and now if only they made Misha slightly less of a pain to recruit. So that will do it for part 1 of the Thracia 776 Iceberg. I hope you found it interesting and hopefully learned something about the game. All of my sources are linked in the doc in the description if you want to check them out. A huge thank you to Louie for that amazing voice work help, and everyone on the Hacking Hell Discord who's been putting up with me while I make this. I'm making this Iceberg because I want more people to know about Thracia, and because no one's done a full explanation of any Thracia Iceberg. I knew absolutely nothing about video production going in, so I've basically taught myself how to record and edit. I'm still learning, so hopefully as I continue I'll get better at that. I've already started on part 2 of this Iceberg, which covers tiers 4 through 7, and they're even more insane, so make sure to stick around for that. If you want to see part 2 as soon as it comes out, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Once again, this was Fire Emblem, and thank you for watching.